Hi everybody, my name is Lauren and I wanted to make a video about living in Mexico while also being visually impaired. So it's kind of a different thing, but obviously we're all over the world, and I think the general maybe assumption that people would make, and probably the assumption that I made, was that everything will be harder. Like, you're going to a new place, you don't speak the language. Many people have the conception of Mexico as a developing country, that things just aren't going to be as easy. And while there definitely are disadvantages, I'm not going to lie about that, I feel like most of those are pretty obvious, and I can make another video about that later. But I also wanted to point out that there are actually advantages to living in Mexico, being visually impaired, versus the US, which is where I'm from. And I would say, when you, at least from me, from my perspective, when I put everything together, it is much, much, much easier for me as a visually impaired woman to live in Mexico versus the US. And these are just some of the reasons. I have two practical ones and then three sort of cultural different ones that I can talk about. As far as just a little bit of background on me, I am technically legally blind according to the US, or visually impaired, which basically just means that even with any type of glasses or any type of corrective lenses, I still can't see well enough to drive. But as far as visually impaired people, I see really, really, really well. So I'm kind of in that in-between place where, depending on the context and depending on what activity I'm asked to do, I could appear to people to be perfectly sighted, or I could appear to be extremely visually impaired, especially if you want me to play a sport. Don't ask me to play volleyball. But so it just depends. So I'm a teacher. Being a teacher, it doesn't affect me at all. Actually, being a student was much harder being visually impaired than being a teacher. So just like that different category is a very different experience. So, and also my vision is not degenerative. So I see the same now as I did when I was a child, and my vision will not deteriorate. I have a condition called achromatopsia, which is genetic and pretty rare. And obviously everybody's vision deteriorates, but mine won't deteriorate anymore, besides age. And the only thing, my eye muscles have gotten weaker. So you might notice one eye will kind of take over and then the other eye takes over. And that's why that happens, because my eyes are weaker. But anyway, I say all of that to say that's the context. I don't presume to speak for anybody else who has a visual impairment, for anybody else living in Mexico, for anybody else, even with achromatopsia. Everybody has a different perspective, and this is just my experience. So I'd say the first thing in Mexico that makes it a lot easier for me, and it's probably an advantage over sighted people, is there's not as many signs and they're not labeled as well. So you might hear a lot of foreigners complain about this about Mexico. For me, I love it because I can't see the signs anyway. So I feel like if speaking Spanish, I am less disabled than someone who can see perfectly fine, who wants to go and read the signs and figure out where they're going or where they are. Because I can just ask somebody on the street and say, where's the, such and such place, and they can give me directions easily. So I would say if you are visually impaired or have any type of disability, definitely whatever time that you spend learning Spanish to whatever ability you're able to will definitely pay huge dividends, much more than somebody who might not be disabled, because people are really friendly and are really helpful. So if you can actually talk to them, you will get way farther in what you want to do. And I was shocked how and I'm from the Midwest, so and from the US, so we're known for being friendly, but I feel Mexican hospitality and people are just a whole nother level of helpfulness. So that was the first thing. The second thing that's also a practical thing, and this is probably the biggest thing, and it's probably the biggest reason that it's easier for me to live in Mexico than the US, and that is transportation. So a lot of people in Mexico don't have cars. You don't have to have a car. So whatever city I'm in, I can have a bus. Taxis are much more affordable. If Uber is available, or there's also in Mexico City there's DD, which is like another Uber-like company, much more affordable than the US. Obviously in the US I had to rely on taxis sometimes, but it was very difficult because it is so expensive. And where I live, our public transportation was horrible. Like, you'd wait an hour for a bus, and then like my university was like 20 minutes by car. If I wanted to take the bus and everything lined up perfectly, it would take me over 2 hours. So usually I had to rely on family, friends, and like who wants, I mean, obviously sometimes you have to do that, but most of the time, like, you want to feel independent. You want to feel like you want to go to the store, you can go to the store. If you want to, you know, have lunch with a friend, you don't want to say, oh, how am I going to get home? Can they drive me? Do I have to ask somebody else? Just the whole pain thing. Also, since a lot of Mexicans don't drive, the streets I have found to be generally very walkable. Obviously this will depend on where you live, but there's just more people out walking in general, so I feel safer. I feel like it's easier for me to walk places, and there's more stores, things around me that I can actually walk to. And because where we live, the climate is pretty mild, it's really easy to walk places. Even like where my family is from, we have horrible weather. It's either really hot, really cold, or raining. So like being in Mexico has been just very nice to actually be able to walk places. And then obviously the next three things are kind of cultural. So obviously you're gonna meet different people, right? Like there's helpful people in every country, there's rude people in every country, but I'm just talking about cultural sort of generalizations, I guess you could say, that I have found in my experience that make living in Mexico easier. So the first one, I would say, like I kind of touched on this already, Mexican culture, people generally are extremely helpful. They're extremely understanding. They're very open. So I feel like in Mexico, if I just tell somebody, oh, I can't see that, could you help me? They're much more likely to help me with it. And when they do it, obviously if you're disabled, you have experienced this before where people will help you with things, but they can be really condescending about it, or they don't ask you if you need help. They'll just sort of like push it on you, and then you can see that they've, you know, given themselves a pat on the back to be like, oh, I've done my good deed for the day. Whereas most of the time, I have never felt that condescending attitude from a Mexican person. Obviously, I'm sure it exists somewhere. But generally people are just helpful, and they don't see it as a big deal. They're just like, yeah, that's what we do. You want directions? Okay. You want, like, oh, you can't see that? Okay, I'll help you with it. Like, it's just not a thing that they, you know, would think is a big deal for them to help you with. And you know, a lot of times if you don't know, if you can't do something, they'll usually just assume it's because you're foreign and not because you have a disability. So sometimes that can play into it too. It's like, oh yeah, I'm foreign, I can't see that. But yeah, it's just I can't see it. But so that I think is a huge part. Obviously, I think this is true anywhere. People can also be like overly helpful, and this can be a regional thing as well. Like my husband was with his elderly uncle, and he's very like, he looks old, but he's he wants to do his own thing, and you know, if he wants to do it, you know, he doesn't want help, and obviously you should respect that. If somebody doesn't want help, obviously don't give it to them. And they were walking down these stairs, and you know, my husband's like, do you want help? And he's like, no, I got it. So they went down all these stairs, and he's waiting for him, and these two guys came up, and they're like, why did you not help you know, uncle, what's wrong with you? Like they don't even know him. So that can also exist in Mexico, where people are just like their intentions are good and they want to be helpful, but I think that also exists in the U.S. where if you don't want help, you know, don't feel bad to say, oh, you know, actually I'm okay, you know, and don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. At least that has been my experience. Um, I would say this one, the second, who is it? The number three, or yeah, number four. Um, this can be good or bad. I would say generally in Mexico, like when I titled or when I opened the video and I said I was legally blind, that's a label that we would use in the U.S. For legal purposes, right? You're entitled to certain things. You are entitled to certain things in school. You might get extra money, not a lot, and obviously you're not allowed to drive. Now, these labels, I'm sure they exist in Mexican law, but generally speaking, people are not as obsessed with labels, and this can be, I can understand how people could see this as a negative, especially because like a diagnosis can really help people. It can, you know, make sense of things in their life. It can give them access to certain things, but it can also really put you into a box, and then it causes whatever institutions to just do a checklist. And unfortunately, we can't really legislate people just being decent. So I would say, like, if you use certain terms, like, I would never tell somebody in Mexico, like, oh, I'm legally blind, unless it was a certain reason, because people would just hear blind and they don't really, I usually would just say, oh, I can't see that, or I have trouble seeing, and like you don't have to tell them anything else. You don't need to tell them I was unless you want to, I guess, or if they're close to you. But generally people are not really concerned with it. They just, like, you are who you are, and they'll get to know you, and if you can do certain things, you do them, and if you need help, you ask them and they'll help you. So like my in-laws are really wonderful, and like they all know that I can't see well, but they don't really think of me as like, oh, she has this thing, like, and sometimes I'll feel like, did they understand what I like told them? But then when we'll go to cross the street, like my mother-in-law will always hold my hand, like, so it's really sweet, and really, like, I know that, like, she knows there's certain things maybe I can't do as well, but she doesn't see me as, oh, she's disabled. Like, I feel like in the U.S. We tend to just like box people and say, oh, you're disabled, you're this, or, and especially for people like me who are kind of on both sides of the fence, it can be a little bit difficult, because you always feel like, well, am I disabled or am I normal? Like, what am I? I don't fit in anywhere. And so I feel like that has been really freeing in Mexico, to just kind of be like, I don't have to pick a side, I don't have to pick a box. It's just like, I can do this, I need help with this, that's it. And I would say most people are very, you know, they just accept you for who you are. But and one of the other sort of misconceptions is that schools don't offer any help for disabled kids. Obviously this is going to vary by school. I know the school I went to, legally I was entitled to certain things. I got nothing. I got absolutely nothing. The things that I got, I didn't even need. Like, they gave me things, I'm like, I don't need this. Like, I can actually read print. So but they would give me like these huge, large print things, but then the teachers were just not helpful at all. I could do a whole other video on that. But anyway, the point of the matter is, other schools in the U.S. obviously were helpful. My school, I had not one teacher. Well, I had one teacher, my 9th grade math teacher, who actually offered me help and support. So the laws were there, but as a child, like, you don't really know how to advocate for yourself, I guess. And at the end of the day, you can't force people to be decent, like I said. Whereas like my son, we went to a public school where we live, is not the most affluent area. And there was a disability teacher, and my background is in education. My master's degree is in education. So I'm familiar with, how things should be done in the classroom. And the teacher that they had there, that she worked with kids, she was up to date on everything, all of the newest research that we have that helps kids with disabilities. You know, she had her classroom, but she spent most of her time working with the children within the classroom. She knew, obviously she knew sign language, Mexican sign language. She knew, you know, she would teach kids Braille if that's what they needed. And there were even kids who hadn't been officially tested, and she believed they were on the spectrum, but the parents didn't feel comfortable being like with their kids being tested. And you know, there unfortunately is still a stigma in some places with some parents about that, everywhere in the world, even though there shouldn't be. And she was like, well, I still work with those kids because I understand that their parents don't feel comfortable with that. And I was like, well, that's really, you know, cool and really nice. Now, obviously, not all schools are going to have that. It just happened to be that school. But I just think just to assume, like, oh, it's Mexico, they're not going to know about disability needs is not true. I will say the 2 private schools that I taught at did not have that. So also don't just assume, oh, it's a nice school, they're going to know about disability education. Not always the case. Anyway, that's a different issue. I would say there's 2 more. Generally speaking, Mexico is very inclusive. So like if you go to the grocery store, you'll see the grandma, the grandkids, everybody together. Most places are very family oriented. And this not only benefits families, it benefits older people who are included in everything, but also helps people who are disabled, because everybody is not expecting everything to just go very, very fast, to be a certain way. Like I said, if you need extra help, if you don't fit into the norm, whatever that is, you won't just be excluded. People won't expect you to just not attend things. Now, obviously, physically, the environment might be more difficult, but as far as like the people accepting you, you know, me just being visually impaired, you know, I haven't found any place where you like, oh, you go sit over there to the side because like you don't fit in or something like that. So, and obviously that wouldn't affect me as much, but I would say, for example, you know, if somebody's not, you know, neurotypical or they have other issues, they're going to have a much easier time as far as people just accepting, you know, any sort of behavior that maybe is a little loud or a little bit different. Like, they're not, it's not going to care as much, generally speaking, culturally speaking. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is that every city or school is going to be different. So when you hear people say, oh, the streets are really bad, or the school didn't help my kid, it, you know, just because it's a different country, I feel like this principle applies everywhere. Like where we live, our city, the sidewalks are really wide. There's a little strip on the side so you can see the contrast between the sidewalk and the street. Everything in the downtown is handicap accessible. All the parks are as well. But if you go just an hour away, there's another city that's a lot more popular with foreigners. That's very hilly, a lot of cobblestones. When we went there for my parents to see it, I was falling like every block. I was a miracle I didn't hurt myself. Because it was just so difficult for me to walk, and it was just so uneven. So if you do go somewhere in Mexico and like it's not as accessible, that doesn't mean that somewhere else isn't, or that that's all of Mexico. Again, not everything is an advantage, but there are definitely advantages to being visually impaired in Mexico. And I would say when I put everything together, for me personally, it is much, much easier for me to live in Mexico being visually impaired, not just physically, like getting around and doing things, but also mentally, emotionally, socially. It is so much easier. And I didn't even realize that there were things that I was missing or things that could be better, because it's all I knew. So I would just say that to encourage everybody that, yeah, there are difficulties, there are some disadvantages, but there's probably advantages that you might not even think about. And while these are my personal advantages, I think it could apply to many other situations as well. So thank you so much for listening, and it was really great getting to make another video, and I will see you guys next time.